Captain Woody, welcome to Sun City Meet the Author.
Thank you, thank you.
Can you give us a gist, maybe instead of a nutshell, a seashell of what your book, Where Have All the Shrimp Gone, Boats Gone?
Well, it's about the shrimping industry, and basically it's about where have all the shrimp boats gone. In 1980, shrimping peaked out, and there were over 1,500 shrimp boats licensed in South Carolina to catch shrimp. Every year from 1980 on, every 5 years it halved itself. So in the last year of putting this book together, it took me 6 years, I canvassed the whole state. There are less than 36 working shrimp boats in South Carolina. So this was the impetus, I guess you may say, to do this book. Myself as a shrimper and a lot of my shrimper friends, many of us knew old stories that this old guy and that old guy had told us, but none of us knew the whole story. So I was way out of my league. There was a lot of divine intervention, and we've got the history of our shrimping industry in this one book.
Now, I don't want to take away from what you're going to tell us about the book, but when I closed the last chapter, just like all your other readers, what do you want me to learn from your documentation?
Well, the shrimp didn't care about anything that happened in the industry. They didn't care about the price of fuel going up. They didn't care about the men that were injured on the job. They didn't care about the men who spent their nights out on the boat and were telling their children and their wives good night, and they wouldn't come home. And the shrimp, throughout this whole history, they did what they've always been doing. And as we come to the end of the book, everyone's saying, well, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen now? And we kind of explain that. But just remember in this whole talk that the shrimp never cared about what was going on.
It's a great perspective. Now, we're going to learn a lot about you in this book as a shrimper. But we also probably already know you a little bit as a restaurateur. How did that come to be, Captain Woody?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. A friend of mine, John Rumsey, owns Palmetto Bay Marina, and I was shrimping out of Palmetto Bay Marina with a shrimp boat I had. And John told me one day, hey, I've sold the marina. He had 2 partners, and he said, they're probably not going to let you shrimp and sell your shrimp on the dock. So long story short, we wound up opening a restaurant. And John's still here in the area. We're great friends. My wife and I, who just showed up, my wife Lynn and I and John opened that restaurant, Captain Woody's. It was a great thing, a lot of fun, met a lot of wonderful people. There's some great stories about it, but we'll move on from that.
Captain Woody, I read that this book, and you might have mentioned that it took 6 years to write this, and that seems like it would have brought you some challenges as a writer. Tell us about some of those.
Well, Georgia, I never intended to write a book. I didn't consider myself a writer. If you ever have the opportunity to have the book in your hand, whether the neighbor's house, you buy it, or whether you get it at the library, please read the preface. It explains how it all happened. I wanted to see our history written. Myself and all of my other fishermen friends, over the years, someone would tell us a story that some old fisherman had told him or even told his father. And we all knew different pieces of history, but no one knew our whole history. So this is what the intention of the book was. I went in this to be an interviewer, interviewing fishermen and bringing the interviews back to a writer. I did not go into this to write a book. I did it by default.
Now, what I saw from the book, to me, it was a who's who in the shrimping industry here in South Carolina. So who are some of those people that you could bring to our attention?
Oh, wow. There's so many people that aren't in the book that should be. You know, there's several of them that live in Del Webb. There's Captain Richard Beasley, a retired fisherman shrimper from Beaufort, an old classmate of mine. I believe Richard's a year older than I. He lives here. And Barbara Hudson, Benny Hudson, who is the grandfather of shrimping on Hilton Head, lives here. But anyhow, every fisherman that spent any amount of time on the water deserved to be in here, but you can't get it all. You can't get it all. What I tried to do was to get some good stories randomly from some fishermen I know, so that people would get a feel for what it is like, what the life is like, what the history is, and what these individuals are like. So
Yeah.
there are many more that deserve to be here that weren't. You just can't. It's 100,000 words and over 300 pictures that came out of shoeboxes, under beds, and out of attics, and from somebody's grandfather and grandmother that gave us for this book.
Oh, what a history, what a history. I was going to ask, you're one of those who's in that book. How did you get your start? What was the motivation for you to get into commercial fishing, commercial shrimper?
Well, I said in the book at one place there that there's two ways to become a fisherman. We say fisherman, it means shrimping, crabbing, fish, all of that. Either you choose it or it chooses you. Well, I was raised in Port Royal, South Carolina, which is where all the shrimping in South Carolina started. Some of the young men my age, their fathers were shrimpers. And it would be nothing to go out on a shrimp boat on Saturday or the weekend or whatever. You just go down to the dock and show up and go. And through the association with them and just the boats being there and us being kids,
It was your life?
many Beaufort boys would go out on a shrimp boat. Some of them took a liking to it and some not. So if
But
you
you
took
liked it.
Yeah, I liked it. I liked it. I liked it enough to do it for 40, 50 years. And I did some other things in between.
Oh, I
When I had my
know.
restaurant, I didn't quit fishing, but I have done other things intermittently. And a lot of shrimpers would do other things in the off season. And some of them did nothing but shrimp or fish. They would switch and go into, when the shrimp season's over, go into crabbing or oystering or clamming or whatever.
You specialized.
Well, I did all that too. I
Ah.
did crabbing, clamming, oystering, shrimping.
Okay, since you were on the inside story of these, things happening in the industry, you've already mentioned it peaked in 1980. What happened?
That's a story. That's a long story, Georgia.
That's
It
the
wasn't
whole
any-
book version.
Yeah, it wasn't any one thing. It just wasn't any one thing. There were a myriad of things, and I think we covered it pretty thoroughly. But here is one thing that I've almost never seen written in a newspaper report about it or an article, anything else. Usually the things are cited: imported shrimp, which was a big player, driving down the price of shrimp, the price of fuel, the price of nets, the price of materials, everything going up. To me, the single biggest thing that set the shrimping industry back the most was other job opportunities. As places developed, gentrification came to the lowcountry, and where there was an old shrimp dock, there became a condominium or a restaurant, which also provided jobs. A man didn't have to go out on a shrimp boat and stay and tell his wife good night over the radio, and before cell phones came in, tell the kids happy birthday. And they could get other jobs and they could make a living. And that to me, when I'm looking back over it and the people I know that came in and out of the industry, now I don't want anyone to be offended, but there is a story in there that it tells one man, Dick Pollitzer told his son, "Captain Stratty, it's easier picking Yankees than it is picking cotton." And what he meant by that, Yankees were coming here, Northerners, Midwesterners coming here, and they brought money, they brought jobs, they brought opportunity. And so a lot of fishermen that got out of it, got out because they could. If those jobs weren't available, they'd still be on those boats. And there would still be all of those boats that there used to be, they'd still be here.
So if I asked you then, do you ever see that there's a possibility where the tide is turning and we would have a vigorously renewed South Carolina shrimping industry?
And here, like we were talking about a minute ago, in everything that happened in this whole industry, incidentally, in South Carolina, it would be 100 years old in 2024. I think it will be greatly celebrated and there'll be the events that happen. But anyhow, the shrimp didn't care. The shrimp never cared if the boats got bigger, the boats got smaller, if the fuel went up, the fuel went down, imported shrimp, prices, other jobs, the shrimp never cared. They have been doing what they've been doing for millennia. So what that means is nothing has changed since it started shrimp-wise. Shrimp boat-wise, shrimp job-wise, there are still shrimp there. They are not going to be left alone. They are not. They will be caught. The industry has already started building back up.
Good.
Building back up.
Now, since your retirement, you've really become a champion for the industry. You, from what I've read of your biography, you have done so many things: Peace Corps, teaching, educating us about how we affect this industry, how the industry affects us. Tell us about some of those experiences and what motivated you to do that.
Well, here was a circumstance stream of events that through a friend I had met that came to work in my fish market. He was from Maryland. He went back to school and wound up getting, after quite a while, his PhD in marine biology. Through him, I met a myriad of marine scientists who opened doors to me that were not ordinarily open to shrimpers, which allowed me to get a placement on Sea Grant, to take other graduate students out on the boat and become familiarized with it, to go up to Baruch Institute up by Georgetown and teach Peace Corps workers harvesting techniques. All this came through this myriad of people that I had met. It wasn't because I had any other skills that no other fisherman had. I had just met these people, and we're all still good friends. They're all in the book.
I think you're making that sound very, very under key. I have a feeling it's the knowledge that you brought.
They were
That's
some
really
incredible individuals, and they're still around, and in fact, just great, good people, great friends. Just like John Rumsey, who helped us build the restaurant. We couldn't afford to build a restaurant on Hilton Head. John sold the marina, and he said, "Woody, I've got a problem. I've got too much money." He said, "Let's build a restaurant." Actually, we put it off for a year because my wife and I got married in 1980 and moved to Defusky. I said, "John, I don't want a restaurant." My wife didn't want a restaurant. But when we came back from Defusky, I had my boat and needed a place to da-da-da-da, so that's what happened there.
Well, I was going to ask you how the restaurant, business became part of your life, but it's interesting. Before we finish up, I have to say I have probably never had the opportunity to talk to too many people like you with this kaleidoscope of life experiences that you've had. Shrimper, boat owner, businessman, restaurateur, author and educator. Which of those roles do you think defines you best?
Probably a fisherman. As far as boat owner, a lot of shrimpers owned it. I was an average fisherman. I owned 5 different boats in my lifetime, which was the industry average. That was no different than anyone else. I did nothing in the industry that no one else didn't do, other than some of the associations that I had with these people on the fringes, the scientists and the this, that, and the other. So I was like anyone else, shrimping, looking for a better way to make money at the industry. So that diversified me.
You've had a rich life. You have a rich history to share with us. Thank you for bringing this book to our attention.
Well, thank y'all very much for letting me come down to this wonderful place. And I hope if Richard Beasley, Captain Richard's out here, I hope he'll show up today. I'm looking forward to seeing him if he does.
Well, that'll be an interesting story.
Yeah,
great.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you, Captain Woody.
Thank you.
You have all picked the right thing to do tonight. I just got through interviewing him for Sun City TV. You are going to love this.
This book is not available on Amazon. If anybody gets this book, please read the preface. It's right behind the dedication. It tells you how this happened. I barely got out of high school. I cannot spell. I've never sat down to write a book. It did take me 6 years. This book is divided roughly into 3 segments. They're all related, but it's how shrimping came to South Carolina. And then once it got here, it started in Beaufort County. Once it got here, how it spread within the county. So it all started down in Fernandina, Florida. There's 2 men of particular note amongst the many people that were involved in this fisherman. Salvador Solicito. Salvador Solicito was from Sicily. He was from generations old Sicilian fisherman families where they did the same thing year after year, day after day. They went out and they caught the fish and they came back to the quay, they sat on the side of the boat and they sold fish. That's all they ever did. The world was changing around him. Steamboats were coming in. boats were coming in and out of Sicily and going all over the world. So he said, you know, I want to see some of this world. So he jumped on one of these ships. He was sailing, the ship was going to North and South America. Well, off the east coast of the United States, the captain noticed a barometer plummeting on the ship, and he went into a port which happened to be Fernandina, Florida. It's a good thing he did. He anchored up in a safe harbor, and a hurricane hit Fernandina. The whole town of Fernandina, and I'm sure many of y'all have been there, was covered with 11 feet of water. The boat survived the storm. After the storm, they did some repairs, and they got underway. But when they got underway, they were one man short. So Lisato had enough of that, enough of the sea. He stayed in Fernandina. He did not speak the language. He was a young man in his early 20s. He returned to what he had left Sicily from, fishing. He had nothing else to do. So he went down to the shore where other fishermen were and started fishing and all. And they were catching shrimp down there, but in the fish nets, but you couldn't sell shrimp. Everybody had shrimp. They were trash fish. They were incidental bycatch that wasn't targeted. So now, over time, he had two relatives from Sicily that came into this country. They came into the Long Island, New York area. They became stevedores at the Fulton Fish Market, Long Island, New York. They communicated. Eventually, they figured out there's a lot of people buying fish up here, but they don't have any shrimp. So they eventually started shrimping, and there's a whole lot more to the story of this, but I got to keep moving through it. So 1913, they shipped 19 train car loads of shrimp from Fernandina to the New York City Fulton Fish Market. 19 train car loads. That's like 40,000 pounds in a train car. So first they did it, they had to give the shrimp away. People up there didn't eat shrimp. They ate lobster, they ate cod, they ate all these other things. The shrimp were not that well known, and a lot of them were just immigrants from all over the world. So anyhow, they got the industry started up there. As it got going, pretty soon, they had to have three things in order to make the shrimping industry work. They had to have an ice supply, they had to have a rail line, and they had to have a dock, a place to handle the seafood and the boats, which they had there. Pretty soon, they caught all the easy-to-catch shrimp, which were close around where they were catching them. They had never been disturbed by man, so they were just laying there thick, like picking up grapes, which they did. They caught piles of shrimp. Then they had to start going north and south looking for more shrimp. If they tried to go south around New Smyrna, they were tearing their nets up on the rocks and the coral and all, so they kept going north, and everywhere they went, they caught shrimp, plenty of shrimp. But pretty soon they were outrunning their infrastructure. They were getting so far from the dock, they were running to find the shrimp longer than we're shrimping. And then they still had to come back to the dock because that was where the rail line was. Oh, that was the big thing. They had to get these shrimp to that New York and Boston and Philadelphia and all markets. The next place that had the infrastructure that would make the shrimping industry work was Savannah, Georgia. Now they had gone up and kept catching shrimp north everywhere. They kept catching shrimp. Like I said, they outrun the infrastructure. So they set up in Savannah. Now Savannah was very unique. Savannah had become a tremendous fishing hub, a fish hub to sell fish. This came about because of these immigrant families that had moved into the Savannah area. They were Sicilians, Italians, you know what that means, and Portuguese. They had friends up north in the market and all. But these guys settled in Savannah. Savannah had no fish supply off its shores, no big amount. Not like was coming into Savannah. These guys, these fish farmers, there were like 5 of them. They were buying all the fish on the East Coast out of Boston and out of Long Island and these places where they had these little draggers catching flounder, and they were buying everything and reshipping it and shipping it back up north. It was crazy. So anyhow, these guys, Savannah developed its industry, its fishing industry, which as shrimping moved into there, they already had some infrastructure. They had the ice, they had the docks, they had the rail lines. Shrimping displaced the fishing. They didn't have any fishing boats, but they had all the damn fish in the world. Like I said, they were buying shiploads of fish. I did say shiploads. What has happened here in South Carolina, which we're trying to get into South Carolina now, it was happening from Texas to North Carolina in slightly different time intervals. But pretty roughly, it was all developing up and down the coast. This shrimping industry, and I don't have hard numbers on it, but I believe collectively with all the people involved in it, that it would create as much employment as General Motors, U.S. Steel, or any of these other big industries. There were thousands and thousands of people involved in it. In Beaufort County, in like 1929, it had a population of 20,000 people, and 2,000 of those people were employed in the seafood industry, just to give you an idea of it. That's 1 out of every 10 persons. Until 1906, there were absolutely no laws in South Carolina about taking seafood. You could take as much as you wanted, in any way you wanted, any time of the day and night, dynamite, anything you wanted to do. There were no laws. So Senator Niels Christensen from Beaufort thought it was time to regulate the seafood industry. He spearheaded the effort, and they created the Board of Fisheries, the BOF, the Board of Fisheries, to regulate the seafood industry, which they did. 1906, they started regulating them. The only thing that they were interested in 1906 was shad, sturgeon, oysters, clams, and diamondback terrapin. Shrimp was not mentioned by the Board of Fisheries until 1924. I believe that's 17 years later, something like that. 1924, before they even mentioned shrimp. Well, they had noticed these guys shrimping. The Beaufort Chamber of Commerce sent a delegation down to Fernandina. They found a man down there, his name was Charlie Vecchio, and said, will you come up to South Carolina and shrimp? We've got a dock, we've got ice, and we have a rail line. So the guy said, yeah. He brought his 10 or 12 boats with him, and they came to Port Royal. Everybody familiar with Port Royal? That's where all the shrimping started. So they came to Port Royal and started shrimping. When Charlie Vecchio came up here, he brought 10 or 12 of his boats with him, probably all that he owned at the time. He was 47 years old, and his wife was 24 years his junior. Wow. He named every one of his boats after his wife, Jessie. The Jessie 1, the Jessie 2, the Jessie 3, the Jessie 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Every one of them. So he did incredibly well here shrimping, because he could move further up the coast than the Georgia guys could, off of Fripp Island and all of the, you could shrimp anywhere you wanted them. So he was doing very well there. Pretty soon, Port Royal, the little place of Port Royal, just turned into a shrimping haven. It became filled with shrimp boats. Every time he'd go back, when they first came up here to shrimp, they only shrimped in May and a little bit of June on the big roast shrimp, the big egg-laying shrimp. They did not know that there were shrimp here in September and October. They caught those shrimp. When those shrimp were gone, they said, that's it. They went back down to Florida to work. So every time they went back to Florida, when they'd come back again in the spring, they'd send 2 scout boats up from Fernandina, Florida area to test the waters. And if they didn't come back within a week, they'd know that they were catching shrimp. If they didn't catch any shrimp, they would go back home and then they'd come back up again. So anyhow, every time you come back up this way, there'd be another boat following it. The cat got out of the bag, pulled all this, became filled with shrimp boats. So, in Charlie Vecchio, there were 5 different shrimping companies working out of one dock in Port Royal. Y'all see that big cement dock in Port Royal? Has anyone seen that? That big old thing? That used to be a wooden pier, and that's where they started shrimping, right there. The wooden dock. The ladies and the men that would head shrimp, they worked 24 hours a day. They caught a tremendous amount of shrimp. Not only did other shrimpers from down in Florida and St. Augustine and Fernandina learn about this place and come up here, but the Davenport Brook Shrimp Company from down in Florida also moved up into Beaufort. They were the largest canners of shrimp in the world. They moved up here in 1928. They brought 10 boats with them, and I don't know what the names are. Yeah, there were 10 boats with them, one typical day in October. And now these boats are small boats. These boats are 32, 34 foot, not big boats, not much power, one single net. 8 boats, 8 or 9, I can't remember which boats. No, 8 boats unloaded 900 bushels of shrimp one day. So shrimping was going good. When Port Royal got filled with shrimp, and then it overflowed into Beaufort. Cotton was over, rice was over, the docks in Beaufort, the roads were starting to get a little better developed. The docks, they just didn't have the use for it that they used to have, so that was a perfect fit for the shrimp boats to come in. In Beaufort, the waterfront in Beaufort, where the waterfront park is now, behind all those stores were docks. And my 2 guys came up here. One's name was Joe Solo. He came in to downtown Beaufort and took the dock that Charlie Vecchio had in Beaufort, which is the last dock closest to the bridge downtown. And then the other guy that came into Port Royal, his name was John Miluzewicz. He was a Yugoslavian. There were a few Yugoslavians that came here, and 2 of these families stayed here and have remnants still here. But anyhow, so John Marion was in Port Royal. Joe Solo was in Beaufort. Shrimping kept growing. The boats kept getting bigger. Started spreading. Now Hilton Head, this area, it's going to have a little different timeline. We're going to do that as a separate segment. But anyhow, I don't know. I've never read anything that said they were compensated. Quite possibly. I just don't know. But the men that owned the boats did not man them. They were manned by the Coast Guard. John Marion had 3 boats that were 50 foot and over. And they went. Other men up and down the coast had boats from Texas everywhere. They were running up and down the coast. And everything had turned into a submarine. A porpoise come up, guy, I saw a damn submarine. The Japs are coming, the Japs are coming. And so, they had all these coastal patrol boats and all. The Princess Mary, one of John's 3 boats, was sunk off the Charleston. So, as the war came to an end, it had a reversing situation. Now, another thing that happened during the war was when the government had these boats, they put these radios on them. Fishermen didn't have radios on these boats. Prior to World War II, there were no radios, certainly no CBs. Shrimpers had CBs long before the truck drivers did. There was a little article in the News and Courier, I think in the 1960s sometime, that made mention of imported shrimp. I think it said, if I remember correctly, something like this, that 2 million pounds of shrimp were imported into America last year. And then every few years this number went up. And every few years it went up. And I think there was one time that it said something like 8 or 14 million pounds some years later were imported into this country. Well, they were talking about wild-caught shrimp, not the pond-raised shrimp. That hadn't started happening yet. When the pond-raised shrimp started happening, that had a big effect on the shrimping industry. It caused the price to go down. Another thing that we were talking about earlier is that the shrimping industry in South Carolina, it peaked out in 1980. There were over 1,500 shrimp boats licensed to shrimp in South Carolina and catch shrimp. From 1980, every 5 years it cut itself in half. So 1980 to 1985, from 1,500, 750, then like 325, then 150. And Parris Island, everyone knows about Parris Island, Marine Corps base. Parris Island had a major impact on the shrimping industry. And here's how it happened. Men came from all over this country, this southeast area, to get these good paying government jobs at Parris Island, because after World War I, Parris Island started booming. They realized we need to have soldiers. So anyhow, Parris Island boomed. They were good paying jobs, and people came from all over. And it wasn't these men, but it was their sons and their grandsons that became shrimpers. And they, just like myself, I became a shrimper through association with a boy my age whose father was a shrimper. Tony Vukas from Yugoslavia was one of our local shrimpers there. So Paris Island did have an effect. Now, two brothers, Norman and Buster Gay, both of their fathers, and both of these guys have gone from this earth. They would be right at 100 now. So anyhow, both of these men became shrimpers because the Portuguese, these other guys were already here shrimping. Their fathers had come to this area for those good paying jobs at Paris Island. They were shrimp boat, and they became through association like that. They eventually built pretty good sized shrimping industries on an empire on a local level. So at Hilton Head, there's a couple of things. This book is laced with stories that fishermen have given me that don't fit into the history, so they're little sidebars and all. Does anyone know the name Hudson, Benny Hudson? Benny. Okay, well, Benny Hudson. Benny was already on the island back when the shrimping industry started. But Benny, we're going to Hilton Head in just a minute. So Benny, he was shrimping on Hilton Head, and he was sending his shrimp across the river to Buckingham, and a truck would take him to Savannah to one of those fishmongers. That guy would sell Benny shrimp. And Benny had 2 or 3 little boats there shrimping. And that guy would sell Benny shrimp and deposit Benny's money in the bank for Benny. There were no banks on Hilton Head. There were no telephones on Hilton Head. There was certainly no ice machine. And I don't know that there was any electricity back then. There was no bridge. So he was depositing Benny's money, and Benny would bring him all the shrimp. So one day Benny was over in Savannah, and he went to the bank, and he noticed he had a lot more money in his account than he thought he should have, and he took it out. Went back to the island. Well, sometime later, the bank calls Buddy Matthews, who was one of these fishmongers, who was Italian. Their name was Carinas until they changed it to Matthews. I don't know why they did that. But the bank called Buddy Matthews and told him, and then they figured out what had happened. Benny had given them some deposit slips, but the secretary got them mixed up and depositing Buddy's from all this fish he was selling every day. He was selling to restaurants and everybody, a lot of it. Deposited Benny's account. So when Benny came over the next time, Buddy told Benny, said, Benny, said, that money out of your account, you know, she deposited our money in your account. Buddy also told Benny, said, Benny, we've done business all our life. Our daddies did business. He said, I'm not going to come after you about this money. He said, I'm not worried about my money. I'll get it back. He said, that's the bank's problem. So Benny didn't come to town, and the bank was getting kind of nervous. Well, before all this happened, Benny had gone to the bank in Georgia and wanted to borrow some money to buy a shrimp boat, and he was turned down. Then he told Buddy Matthews, you tell that guy at the bank, that money was in my account, and I'm going to buy a shrimp boat with him. Well, things cooled off. Then he told Buddy to tell the guy at the bank, I'll bring your money back on one condition. If you apologize to me the way you spoke to me in front of the people that were there when you spoke to me that way, which they did, and they got the money back. So Hilton Head's timeline was a little different in that. There were no newspapers. A lot of stuff that I got out of this book, you know, I gleaned old newspaper articles. In the 1950s, nothing made the headlines of the Beaufort Gazette more than the shrimping industry. It was one of the most important things around it. This is a fact. Nothing made the headlines, big headlines. Shrimpers get caught stealing shrimp. Shrimpers do this, shrimpers do that. They have what they call the Shrimpers War that went on quite a while. And what it was during World War II, the boats were not allowed to be in the open ocean. Not unless you were one of those special patrol boats, coastal patrol boats. They were not allowed to be in the ocean open where they usually shrimp. So what they did was they allowed them to go up in the estuary system that was closed to shrimping. Joey Morris, a shrimper, his father, when his father retired from the insurance business. His father was never in the law profession or anything, but his nickname was the Judge because he was a very honest man. So Joey and his daddy bought a little country store over here on Ladies Island. All over Ladies Island is St. Helena. They bought a little cement block country store so his daddy could have something to do. Well, there were a bunch of shrimp docks in the area. So at the end of the day, the shrimpers would come over and have a cold beer. And they'd all go into the very back of the store because they did sell milk and bread and eggs, and the ladies and other people would come in and the kids. So they just got in the back of the store, let everybody alone, drank the beers and talked after work. Invariably, as it got on in the evening, the phone would ring. It would be somebody's wife looking for him. As soon as that phone rang, everybody said, "Not me, I'm not here, I'm not here." And the judge, he didn't like lying to these people. So there were two courses he could take. If he answered the phone and it was your wife for you, he would tell you, "Bob, it's your wife," or whatever her name was. Or he just wouldn't answer the phone. He just let it ring. Because he knew what it was going to lead to. So anyhow, one time the phone rang. The judge answered the phone. Jack Chapman, one of our shrimpers. He said, "Jack, it's Sally for you." Jack's reading back with his buddies. "Usually if that happens, you got caught, you got to go home. The game's over." So Jack says in a very robust voice, "Tell Sally I'll call her in a few minutes when I get finished with my beer." Well, all the guys are looking around. Nobody does that. So Jack finished his beer, and then he walks up to the other phone of the dial phones. He picked up the phone, calls his house, says, "Sally, don't you ever call me here again when I'm drinking beer with my buddies. I'll be home when I get damn well ready. And when I get there, dinner better be on the table and it better be hot." Boy, everybody just couldn't. Jack just rose to the top of the class. Well, just about the time Jack finished his little spiel, the phone rang. He had his thumb on the receiver. So then the shrimping on Hilton Head was going along. And then in I'm going to say 74 or something, maybe as earlier, the Hilton Head Fishing Cooperative opened. And it was where the local fishermen, mainly the black fishermen, could have their own dock and their own business, reap more of the benefits of their labor. So it opened. There were 5 shrimp docks on Hilton Head in those days. I'm guessing there were maybe 70 shrimp boats on Hilton Head up until about the 1980s when it peaked out. And another thing that we talked about earlier is what was the demise of the shrimping industry, what caused it? Well, a lot of times it's attributed to imported shrimp driving the price down and blah, 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 and expenses of nets and everything costing more and all that. But I honestly believe the single biggest reason the industry demised was there were other jobs. If there weren't other jobs, those men would still be on those boats. Same thing like farmers all over this country. There were thousands of little farms, but it wasn't just all the larger farms that drove them out. They had somewhere else to go, and if they didn't, they'd still be farming. So that's what I think is the single biggest cause of the shrimping industry. Shrimping was once considered the most dangerous, not shrimping, commercial fishing, the most dangerous occupation in America. And it was dangerous, but it was human error. And there's some very interesting stories here about some of the things that happened in the industry. In relation to that, not one fisherman ever blamed the winch. The winch was the most dangerous. It's gruesome, tremendously gruesome. That's where most people got killed. And like I said, no one blamed the winch. Human error, faulty equipment, a chain too rusty, a block not greased enough, and the shiver worn out. And there's terrible accidents out there. And boats burning. Here's something. I want to touch on Key West now. So we've got to go back to not long after World War II. Shrimping had been a feast or famine industry. We had a local season. The boats were not real big. When the season was over, that was it. you starved. If you didn't have a good season, you know, you maybe got a job if you could find one, but basically, traditionally, really, fishermen are pretty much considered a poor lot. I mean, that's probably the image that most people have of the average fisherman. They didn't get filthy rich. Some whalers did, but other than that, just a regular fisherman didn't. So, the fishing industry, and these guys, I'm trying to think what I'm trying to say now.
Key West.
Key West, thank you, thank you, thank you. Has none of y'all ever done that, shame on you. So anyhow, so if you had a bad season or something, that was it. You know, and there were no other jobs, it was hard. So by accident entirely, they knew there were shrimp down in Key West. There's all these hundreds and hundreds of shrimp boats, all from Texas to Gulf of Mexico, Pensacola, you know, everywhere. Mayport, everywhere. There were shrimp boats catching shrimp. They weren't catching any in Key West. They knew there were shrimp there because the guys catching the snapper and the grouper were having these fish spit up these big shrimp. They'd go out there and try to catch them. They couldn't catch them, so they just didn't think there were that many of them. Then one time, one of these fishermen, 1949, was trying to catch some of these shrimp and his winch broke. He couldn't get his nets up, so he had to keep dragging around till he could fix it. And by the time he got it fixed, it was going on into dark, and when he got his nets up, there was a bunch of shrimp there. The shrimp were nocturnal. The water was so clear that the shrimp hid all day and they didn't notice. They started shrimping at night. Boy, did they do good. And the shrimping, it was just like the very first guys that shrimp down in Fernandina all over again. That was the cause for boats being built larger with more power and more capacity to be able to go to Key West. The season never ended in Key West. It still doesn't now. It's still doing good down there. So that was a big shot in the arm, so to speak, to the shrimping industry. It did make them get bigger, more powerful boats that could carry more ice and fuel. Now, something else I can tell you about is how the shrimp boat developed. When it first started, there were no shrimp boats, of course, and once they figured out how to do a net and all, they were anything that they could put a motor in, they put a motor in and start dragging the shrimp net with it. But it was the Greek fishermen, sponge divers, and the boat builders from the west coast of Florida that understood the land of boats. And they came over from the west coast to the east coast, and they started building boats. They started building shrimp boats. And they built a bunch of them. And all these families, Chiliacus, Foley, oh Lord, there's just a whole bunch of those names that were pretty much common, all of them. And often people would work with them and learn boat building. And pretty soon, everywhere, they took the original design of a Greek sponge boat, pointed on both ends. When the shrimping unit, they cut one end off and made it square, and made a back work deck and put a house on it, and it evolved into the shrimp boat. The shrimp boats of today are nothing like the shrimp boats of the 50s or 60s even. Very commonly today, a shrimp boat has a washer and dryer on it. My last boat had central heating and air conditioning. I had a wash machine I put on the boat, I put it on the back deck myself, but it didn't come with one. A lot of boats have washers and dryers. The galley is just like a condominium. Everything is electric refrigerator, freezers, anything you want, ice makers, anything. Oftentimes there'll be a washer and dryer for the captain and one for the crew. Crew will have their own quarters, captain will have his own quarters. Another thing about shrimping is whoever's the best cook will become the cook. Doesn't matter what your position on the boat is. It doesn't take long for somebody to figure out who the best cook is on the boat. I don't know what else I can tell you. I know there's a lot more, but anybody want to ask a question and then it might lead into something else?
Do you own a restaurant?
I did.
You sold it then?
I did sell it. I had a seafood bar. I was always trying to figure out a way to make more money out of shrimping. When I was shrimping out of Benny Hudson's, I guess it was the early 70s, Benny was selling shrimp out of the restaurant. They had a little thing with shrimp in it. I'd go in there and look at the shrimp. He was getting $4 a pound. We're getting like $1.26. I noticed that the people that were driving up to buy these shrimp had these funny pants and stuff on, not like we wore. Clubs, birds on. Well, I finally figured out these people come from the other end of the island. So eventually I got a place there and opened up a seafood market. And then later I opened up a restaurant. My wife and I, we opened up a restaurant.
Is that the original Captain Woody's on Hilton Head?
Yes. They moved it. We opened it up at Palmetto Bay Marina.
Okay.
John Rumsey, who was a good friend, Bunky Helfrich, and Gary Wheatley, an Australian guy, they had bought that marina, the three of them bought it together. Then when they sold the marina, after having it some amount of years, they made a bunch of money. And John came up to me one day and said, Woody, I got a problem. I said, what's that? John said, I got too much money. He said, let's open a restaurant. I didn't want to do it. My wife and I, we had just gotten married and we moved to the Fusky. We lived on the Fusky the first year of our marriage. We just took a whole year off. So when I came back from the Fusky, what I was doing is I was shrimping out of Palmetto Bay Marina and I was selling my shrimp, and my wife would call different people on the island who wanted to buy shrimp, and when I came in, they would come down to the boat with the cooler and I'd just hang a scale right up in the net and sell my shrimp right there. There'd be so many people there, the dock would be tilting, their toes would be in there. So anyhow, when I came back from the Fusky, the new owners had started developing the marina. And John told me, he said, Woody, they're not going to let you sell shrimp down here like you've been doing. They're going to develop this place, and then you might want to consider getting a place in the marina. I said, John, I really don't want to. John said, John, ask if they'll give me a little tiny space where I can boil some shrimp and sell fresh shrimp, and I figured I can get somebody to sit in there. Well, that graduated into a 53-seat restaurant.
Okay, now you took 6 years to write this book. That's a long time. You don't do things lightly, I guess.
This was way out of my league, Georgia. I never had, if you have the opportunity to get the books in your hand, whether you buy it or get it at the library or whatever, please read the preface. It's right behind the dedication. The dedication is 2 lines, and the preface tells you how this came about. Like I told you, there was divine intervention. I never went into this to write a book. I went into it to see our history written. I looked for an author for 2 years,